So, hi everyone. My name is Sarah Coffman. I am the program assistant at the Roebling Museum, and I'm also getting my PhD in history at Rutgers, New Brunswick. Um, and I'm really excited to welcome everyone to I don't think it's the first ever Black History Month event for the Roebling Museum. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Lynn, but um, the first time since Lynn has started at the museum that there is a Black History Month event. Um, Roebling's Black history is one that we want to learn more about, and so this event is hopefully going to be the not the end of our investigation, but really the beginning of that. So again, thanks for joining. Thanks for being curious about Black history and Roebling. And we're gonna get started with just kind of like an overview of what this what the museum is. So, Lynn, take it away.
So I'm Lynn Calamia. If you haven't met me, I'm the executive director. And this talk tonight, it's part of our ongoing Zoom series. And this year we're doing things a little bit different. So we have three different categories of Zooms that you can tune in for. Last month we did Curator's Corner, and we're going to do a couple more of those this year. And that's where I think you only hear from me, but maybe there'll be guest curators where we'll talk about new artifacts in our collection and sort of a behind the scenes look at the collection. And that's where you can see artifacts maybe you've donated from your families and things like that. Then there's another section, it's called New Research, which is what tonight is. We're going to be just sharing this research that we've been doing that's not quite like exhibit ready. It's not up in the museum yet, but it's stuff that we've been thinking about and learning more about and want to share. But we also want to hear from you guys if you have good leads on things for us to look into. Then the third type of Zoom it's going to be an experts roundtable. So that's going to be really great. We have someone lined up to talk about Washington Roebling's gem and mineral collections. The first one will actually be about the bricks of Roebling. So if you don't know, all the houses in Roebling are built out of brick. So there's certainly a lot of bricks in Roebling, and there's a lot to hear about them. And before you ask the reason this slide is up, we'll go back. It's because all of our programs, we record these and we put them on YouTube. So if you search Roebling Museum and you find our channel, you can watch all of the previous ones. We have a lot where engineers talk about bridges. We've got artists in there. There's all different kinds of things for you to tune in and check out. And the way that tonight is going to run is Sarah's going to give a really great presentation. While she's talking, you're going to submit your questions and comments either in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that. And I think we have some board members and volunteers here too, so they might help us do some answering. If you grew up in town and want to help answer, please. We want to have like really good conversation going. And then at the end, we're going to do a Q&A where I'll bring some questions to Sarah and we'll talk about them. And this slide here is just in case there are people on the call who haven't been to the museum yet, we just want to do a really quick overview. Roebling, New Jersey, which is what we're going to be talking about mainly today, the actual company town side of things. It's on the Delaware River. If you look at the top of this image, you would be seeing the river, but I cut it off. And then the town was built by the Roebling Company in 1905. They had already had a successful wire rope plant in Trenton at that time, but in the early 1900s, they wanted to expand and produce their own steel instead of buying it from other suppliers. So they chose the site that became Roebling. It's about 11 miles from Trenton in Burlington County. And because it was a more rural area, they felt that they needed to build a town for the workers to live in. And today, that town is a historic district on the National Register, and almost all of the architecture is still intact. So it's really amazing to come and visit. In this picture here, it is an aerial view of the entire campus of the museum. But we really like to talk about how the museum is really four experiences in one. You have the museum, which is, are you pointing at it, Sarah? At the top corner. Um, then you can see our intro film, which really gives a good outline of the history. But then also we have 7 galleries of exhibits with all kinds of stuff on display. There's the mill yard, which you're seeing here in this image with giant chunks of machinery from the former steel mill. And each one of the pieces on display, there's now signs so you can walk out there, take a little nature walk, go and learn about that equipment. Then there's the company town itself. So the museum reopens in March, and we expect you to all come by to take our company town walking tour on Saturdays at 1 o'clock. And you can't see the company town in this image, but you'll see images of it as we go today. And then the last thing, I still like to promote it even though it's not open. We purchased a house in town right across from the museum that we call Roebling Row House, and we're going to be turning it into a historic house museum. So that's set to open in 2028 if all goes according to plan. And you're definitely going to be hearing more about it as we conduct our research. And even this research is in part relating to that project because Black workers lived in row houses. So as we move into the restoration and the actual, hammer and nails kind of start for the project, you're going to be hearing a lot more, especially if you're on our Facebook. All right, so that's all I'm going to be saying. Sarah, you can take it away.
All right. So today's presentation is going to be split into 4 parts. I'm going to lead the first 2 parts where we'll be first talking about what we have learned or what we know about Black life in Roebling and talk about the research that we've been working on and how we learned the things we know. I will turn it over to Lynn so that she can talk about what we have yet to learn. And then we will take some questions from you. But as Lynn said, feel free to put those into the Q&A or into the chat, and we will keep track of those and answer at the end. So before we can even get to Roebling, how did Black people get to Roebling? We need to talk about the Great Migration. So the Great Migration, for people who are not familiar with it, is the mass movement of 6 million African Americans who were living in the southern United States to the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast cities between 1915 and 1970. The Great Migration is divided into 2 waves. The first wave between 1915 and 1930 has the most migration is occurring during World War I as Black people are trying to seek out work in the war industries. So during the first wave, 2 million African Americans leave the South. The most popular locations or their destinations are New York City and Chicago, but other destinations included Philadelphia, Newark, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Los Angeles, etc. Why did this migration occur? What would have caused Black people to move north in such numbers? 2 million people is a lot to move in like a 15-year period. And this requires an understanding of what was Black life in the South like at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. So Black Southerners are on a daily basis experiencing racist violence. They're experiencing economic exploitation as they're predominantly working in the agricultural industry as sharecroppers, and they're in cycles of debt. They are politically suppressed every day. This is their reality. After the Civil War, there was a period in US history called Reconstruction, where formerly enslaved people were legally protected for the first time. Amendments were added to the Constitution that made slavery illegal, established birthright citizenship, and also gave Black men the right to vote. But by the late 1870s, many of the Southern states had disregarded these amendments entirely and passed laws that stripped Black people of their new freedoms. There's also at the same time the rise of white supremacist vigilante organizations that used violence to control and suppress Black people, preventing them from voting. So they lose their voice, they lose their rights, and the North seems increasingly intriguing to Black Southerners because of the promise of being able to vote again, the promise of higher wages, having better employment opportunities in the industrial sector. Some Black people hear through their family and friends networks that moving north is a good idea. And there's better educational opportunities. And in some places like New York and Chicago, there are vibrant Black communities that are forming in Harlem, in Bronzeville, in Chicago. So these are the factors that contribute to Black Southerners' decision making to leave their lives in the South and pursue a life in the North. More broadly, why is the Great Migration important? This massive population movement really changes the population composition of major cities in the North. So in New York, the Black population triples between 1900 and 1930. In Chicago, the Black population grew by 6 times. So this huge shift constructs and further develops Black regions and cities that were really significant places for Black urban culture. So in Harlem, in Bronzeville, you hear about the Harlem Renaissance, the art, the poetry, the music of the Harlem Renaissance. The reason that the Harlem Renaissance is able to happen is because Harlem is flourishing as a developing and growing Black community or Black neighborhood where people are able to live. In New Jersey specifically, so we're getting to Roebling now, there were 80,000 Black residents in the state of New Jersey in 1910. But by 1930, there were more than 200,000 African Americans in the state, and there were 7 cities that had Black residents. So now we're actually in Roebling. In 1914, there were only 2 Black men who were employed at the company. There was an article published in March of that year that described these 2 men as, quote, old and trusted, but it described a majority of other Black prospective employees as, quote, vicious and shiftless. So this article is like explaining at the same time, that Roebling is not employing Italians and they're not employing Black people. They describe Black people as vicious and shiftless. Um, Now, everything would change in the year 1916 when the company started to advertise in local papers that they would hire Black workers for the first time. This is happening during World War I, when Roebling feared that the global war would slow immigration from Eastern Europe, and this would be limiting their main source of labor. By 1918, Roebling as a company town is about 75% Eastern European immigrants. So as a result of the fear of losing their labor source, Black workers were recruited, and this article also describes that they would be housed in brand new brick row houses that were on the south side of the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. So it's like an entirely new tract of houses. There's 30 brick houses. Um, and so this invitation to Black workers made Roebling a unique company town. Many company towns did not allow Black residents or Black workers. In Hershey, Pennsylvania, like a pretty close example to us, there was only one Black household in 1960. So Roebling, 45 years earlier, is saying Black workers, you can come live here and work here. But still, it's worth mentioning that in many northern cities, there was a lot of tension between white American workers, white ethnic immigrant workers, and Black workers, because Black workers had a reputation of being strike breakers or scabs, because companies would use Black workers from the South who were, as we talked about, facing, violence on a daily basis, looking for better opportunities for themselves. They would use Black workers to incentivize them to come north, and that would hinder the labor movement or labor organizing or attempts to unionize. So this tension is informing a lot of ideas that white Americans and white ethnic immigrants have about Black workers. So now I'm going to talk about Black people living in Roebling. So for a quick note for people who are new to Roebling history, because Roebling was a company town until 1947, the houses were rented and the company placed you in a house. You had no choice where you lived. The company over time, from the time that it opens in 1905, they established a placement practice where they would put people who are from the same regions or countries on the same avenue. So, for example, Hungarians lived on Second Avenue. That's the avenue that's closest to the mill. And Romanians lived on Third Avenue. And we can see these patterns in the census. So Second Avenue is like written on the side, and you can see like this family is Hungarian, this family is Hungarian. You can see it very clearly. So 1920 is the first census that recorded Black workers in the new houses that are south of the railroad. The two streets where they were living were Railroad Avenue and Amboy Avenue. So in 1920, a majority of these homes had Black residents. There were 52 Black householders on the census. The reason that I say householders and not homes or households is because there were multiple homes on Amboy and Railroad Avenue where there were 2 or 3 separate householders in one property. And something really interesting about this is often it seems like these people had absolutely no relationship to one another. They didn't know each other. They were not blood related. They just were, the company had placed multiple Black families in the same houses. Um, and so this shows just how many Black families came to Roebling in hopes of finding reliable housing and work during the First World War. And this pattern of placing multiple families who don't know each other in the same house is not something that's happening for the immigrant laborers or American workers that are living north of the railroad. By 1930, the number of Black families practically gets cut in half, and they're isolated just to living on Railroad Avenue. So Amboy is kind of it's mixed slightly, but we see Russian workers and Hungarian workers, Polish workers living on Amboy. Um, and so then by 1940, the number goes down again just to 17, which is the lowest that it is for the census years that we have. And then it kind of stabilizes by the point in 1950, there's 19 Black households. 1950 is a significant census to us because it shows us who actually owned the homes. The company sells the houses to the workers in 1947 and ceases involvement with the company town. So, unfortunately, as the company was gearing up to sell the houses, they were talking about 15 different restrictive covenants. You could see it in this article here. Um, and one of the restrictive covenants was what they call in the article an anti-Negro clause, and it would have prevented houses north of the railroad from being sold to Black workers. So that restrictive covenant did not stand. But regardless, even today, like I live in Roebling, and there are more Black families who live north of the railroad now, but it's still not that many. So the effects are still there, and that there are still Black residents who live on railroad who are connected to railroad from their families. They grew up there. Um, so with all that said, a common question or observation that we get is, so if the company segregated the houses, that means that everyone was affected by segregation. And also Black people got access to the newest and best houses. They were, just freshly constructed in like 1915, 1916. These are both true statements. Um, However, something to consider is that Hungarian and Romanian immigrants had the ability to like move up or move further away from the mill, deeper into the company town, into bigger homes if they needed to. So if you were a Hungarian and you lived on Second Avenue, let's say you arrived in like 1918, it's just you, your wife, and your daughter. uh, you know, 5 or 6 years later, your family has grown. Now there's 7 or 8 of you. You could communicate with the like chief timekeeper and say, hey, like my family is growing. Is there a possibility that I could get a larger house? There were homes on Fourth Avenue that could accommodate more people than clearly more people than a 2-bedroom row house, which were the homes on Second Avenue. And we see this on the census. So families who had lived on Second Avenue in like 1910 or 1920, by 1930 or 1940, they have moved up in the town and living on Fourth or Fifth Avenue in like twin style homes or the like multi-family homes that have, close like 7 or 8 bedrooms or 3 stories. We have no evidence on the census that Black people had the option to move into the larger homes on 4th or 5th Avenue. In fact, there was actually only one Black man on the census who didn't live on Railroad Avenue, and he was a special case. He was one of the two like original Black employees that I mentioned a couple of slides ago. He had been living and working in Roebling since 1904. So it's just worth mentioning that like it doesn't seem like African Americans had the same opportunities to, as their families grew, to move into bigger spaces. Like other ethnic groups in Roebling, Black residents had their own social sphere for leisure and for worship. They had their own recreation hall separate from the one on Hornberger, and it's comparable to a place like the Hungarian Home, where people come together and they have social events and such. Black community members, they also attended the Tabernacle Baptist Church. So this church was led by Reverend Edmund Alexander. So this is a photo of the church. It was located at the end of Railroad Avenue, and this is the Reverend himself, Edmund Alexander. And the church was open between 1934 and 1941. A crucial source for us in learning more about Black history in Roebling is a handful of oral histories that we have. So one of the oral histories is with a woman. Her name was Lula Boone Jenkins. She was born in Roebling in the 20s. She passed away in 2016, but she's interviewed and featured in our welcome video at the museum. And so in her interview, she just discusses the church. So she says, quote, "We had a little church at the end of our street, and it was called the Tabernacle Baptist Church, and we had Sunday school there and services. It was really nice. That was our social gathering, really. On Friday nights, they used to have a box party where the girls would make a box lunch or box meals, and men bid on them." So I think it's really cool to like hear about the kind of different social events that were happening at the church. In terms of schooling, the place where the Black experience continues to be separate from that of immigrants and Americans is through schooling. So there was a segregated Black school for elementary school age children called Florence Station. They taught from kindergarten to 6th grade in a 2-room schoolhouse. So that's pictured here. It's still standing. It's off of Route 130. And we have the annual registers for the school from the mid-20s. I have one on the slide here, through the late 20s, I believe. Lynn, you can correct me when you hop on or in the chat. And this register, you can see there are several children who lived off of Railroad Avenue. And these are familiar names to me as a person who has like spent a lot of time looking at the census. The Bordens, the Cobbs, like these are families who were living in Roebling in the 20s and 30s. After 6th grade, the students would go to the Roebling school. Again, Lula Jenkins talks about in her oral history, like what was the school actually like. She attended the school in it would be like the 30s. And she said that the school stayed open until 1954, which I find fascinating. When she was there, she said that they had one teacher for kindergarten to 3rd grade and a second teacher for 4th through 6th grade. And she remembered she was attending the school before they had installed bathrooms in the basement. So she she made me laugh, like just listening to her oral history and like talking about, I was so scared to go to the outhouse because the outhouse was like very close to the woods, and she was scared of like going out there alone. So that's a bit about attending OTAs, like to attend the school. And as I said, the students after, finishing 6th grade, they would move and attend Roebling School. This is something that I've heard from multiple residents. It's that, the school was integrated. And something fascinating that I found while listening to an oral history from a man who was the principal of Florence Station and who attended school at Florence Station and at, or I'm sorry, he didn't attend Florence Station, but he did end up going to Roebling School, and he was a Black man. His name is Wilbur Henry. He mentions that Black students were actually segregated from white students in the Roebling School. This would have been in the early 20s, in the early 1920s. We don't know when that practice began or stopped, but it's important to mention. So he said, quote, "We had a room on one floor, we referring to him and other Black students, and we had a Black teacher, and she had about 16 kids in the classroom." So this is definitely something that I think we'd like to learn more about. If there was, if there were other Black teachers who were teaching at Roebling School and they were instructed or in some way told that they had to keep the children separate. So this is definitely something we want to keep learning about. So we talked about living in Roebling. Now I'll talk about working at the mill. What were Black men's and women's experiences working at the mill? One of the most common questions that we get is, was the mill segregated? Because it was very common for industrial labor to be segregated by skill and race in the early 20th century. From what we know, the firm racial and ethnic boundaries of the avenues somewhat disappeared when workers entered the main gate and clocked in for a day's shift. So workers of different backgrounds are, working in this dangerous, dark environment, and you need to trust the people who you're working with. And what was really important is learning ways to communicate with one another. So in Lula Jenkins' oral history, she mentions that her brother Bill learned some Hungarian to communicate with other Hungarian workers. But as I looked through the worker records, a pattern clearly emerged across the records of the types of jobs that Black men held. So Black men were typically firemen, they were helpers, or general laborers. And this is despite having any previous industrial experience. They're typically slotted into these positions. The most common among these jobs, and this is the job that we basically can say with, I'd say, 99% certainty, was a job just for Black men, was the fireman. So this is not the traditional fireman with an axe, but in fact, the opposite. These guys were keeping the fire going. So according to an interview with Harry Reynolds, who was a former fireman, quote, "All you did was shovel coal into those two boilers all day long, and inhaling all that coal dust for 12 hours every day would kill a man." There were very, very, very few white firemen across the worker records. I've spent a lot of time looking at these records. I think I've found one. So I can conclude that it was likely just a job for Black men. Another oral history or interview that we have is with a man named Jesse Starling. He lived at 75 Railroad Avenue, and he worked a different job. So he was called, it was called the scrap baller. As he described, he and another worker were responsible for handling red hot rods that, they're being in the process of being heated and stretched. And if it shot off of the rolls and it was like kind of flying through the mill, his job was to like go to this flaming hot or whatever rod and ball it up before it cooled, or before, if he, as he says, it went up to the roof and set it on fire, or before it killed someone. And he says anyone who ever worked in the rod mill had the scars from the rods to prove it. So similar to how Black families did not progress into bigger houses, Black men's opportunities for growth in their employment were vastly more limited than their white ethnic or American coworkers. So I pulled this worker record on the slide here to kind of demonstrate that. So this is a man who is Alonzo Borden. He migrated from New Bern, North Carolina after his brother wrote him and said that he could get a good job, which I love that showed up on the worker record. So despite the fact that when he gets to Roebling, he is, somewhat advanced in age to be finding work in an industrial place where it's very intense labor, And he also had the experience of working in an oil mill and a sawmill, which is not as common for a lot of Black migrants from the South. Most Black migrants from the South, you'll see on their worker record that it says that they were farmers, they were employed for themselves, or they worked for another proprietor. So I thought this was really unique. But as we look at the back of the worker record where it says what his jobs were, he was really only ever did general labor. So general labor, he worked in the boiler house as a fireman, he was a helper, and his last job before he was, he had compulsory retirement because he was almost 70 years old. He was definitely seven. He was 70 years old at that point. Um, he was a fireman. So it didn't matter that he had, other experience that may have translated to his employment at the Roebling mill. He did not ever advance to a higher position over the course of having worked at Roebling for, several decades at that point. For women who worked in Roebling, this was one of the most exciting finds. Was when we actually were able to say we found a worker record that belonged to a Black woman. Um, but the more common experience for Black women who lived in Roebling was not actually working at the mill. On the census, we see Black women staying at home, working as domestic laborers in other people's homes, or leaving the community completely to work in different industries. Referring back to Lula Jenkins' oral history, she talked about the fact that she worked at the General Motors plant that was in Ewing, New Jersey during World War II. The worker records that we have for Black women, I have one of them on the slide here, all of them are from the World War II era. So Julia Mary Bostic, she was working, her hire date was July 8th, 1945. And she was working as a weaver in the screen shop making insect window screens. Um, so presumably Black women and white women worked alongside each other because we see that they held the same positions. Um, so Black women's experiences were different from Black men's because the women's work was not segregated. There was no job that was like relegated to Black, like only Black women have that job. Now, just because the Roebling Company said, come work here, does not mean that they were going to protect their Black workers or shield them from racism. So, an example of this in the company town is the prevalence of minstrel shows. Minstrel shows were a very common form of entertainment in the community through the 1960s. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what a minstrel show is, a minstrel show was a variety show where actors put black, grease paint or burnt cork on their faces. They sang, danced, and gestured and talked with the purpose of emphasizing Black stereotypes and mocking African Americans. These shows originated in the 1830s, and they were the most popular form of entertainment through the start of the 20th century when film kind of picks up as a medium and vaudeville as well. So it was such a significant form of entertainment through the end of the 20th century that you have traveling minstrel troupes that form and travel through the country to perform. And unlike other coal or steel company towns or cities, minstrel shows in Roebling were not led by a troupe. Instead, town residents themselves would audition, rehearse, and perform solos or as part of the chorus. And these shows are happening multiple times a year at the auditorium on 7th Avenue and Mean Street. And what's really interesting about these is the majority of them were fundraisers. And they were, for the Boy Scouts. I found articles from the Boy Scouts minstrel shows, churches. The Blue Centers football team had an annual minstrel show, etc. So, in fact, the article on the slide shows that there were at times conflicting minstrel shows. So, in this article, Holy Assumption Church in Roebling, they had to move their scheduled minstrel show because the Blue Centers were having their own minstrel show. So that itself I can't help but laugh. But what I find the most interesting about the fact that the minstrel shows are happening in town, and it's like town participants and town residents who are participating, was the fact that these shows are likely where a lot of immigrants to the United States are learning about race in the American context for the first time. So if you're an immigrant from Eastern Europe, you're othered in your own way, right? You don't speak English well, maybe. You're getting used to living in a new country, working in this new place. But through these performances, you're learning that African Americans or Black people are a race that is mocked, that is denigrated, and at the bottom of the American racial hierarchy. You can sit there and laugh and have fun because that's what these were about, is having fun, and it was funny. Um, and think also to yourself at the same time, I'm not part of that racial group. I don't look like that. I don't talk like that. So what actually happens then when you have an immigrant who's gone to, these shows and learned this about race through the minstrel shows, and they meet an actual Black person who is not just a white person in blackface, but or pretending to be Black, but a real Black person, or when they go to work and they have to interact with Black people, what's actually happening from these interactions. And then the other place that stereotypes show up is in the worker record. So anti-Black stereotypes are they're happening in obviously in the company town, and then I want to kind of look at it on the other side. So at Roebling, there were a handful of specified reasons why workers could be let go. We know these reasons because they appear on the backs of worker records, and they also appear on the termination notices that the company gives to workers when they're let go. So the reasons are, and I'm just going to list them. There's not going to be a quiz, so don't worry about it. But incompetent, unsteady, careless, dishonest, wages, floater, insubordination, ill health, housing conditions, leaving city, leaving country, reducing force, and physical reasons. What is not a reason, but appears on the back of several Black worker records, is lazy. Lazy serves as a character judgment outside of the typical reasons that I just listed. Um, do you want a lazy steel worker? No, you don't want a lazy steel worker. I'm not saying that like you want to keep people who are lazy around, but what this is more so about is that they're pulling from a very clear stereotype of Black people that comes from, the end of the 19th century. So after the Civil War, you have former plantation owners and white Southerners who are arguing that without the institution of slavery over Black people, that they're just idle. They're not capable of working without this system of control over them. This stereotype persists into the 20th century, and it shows up in places like these worker records. I have gone through hundreds of worker records of African American and white workers, and I have never seen lazy used to describe or explain the termination of immigrant workers or American workers. So I view this as a racialized language that's showing up in these records that the company is using to explain letting Black workers go. So it's an interesting place where these stereotypes that are very familiar show up. So all the things that I just talked about, how are we learning these things? Where do they come from? What types of research are we doing to discover more? The first thing you've seen several photos or scans of Black worker records. It's a mouthful today, and this is because we are in the process of scanning every Black worker record that we have. I have made it through the first half of the alphabet. The other half of our worker records are out being digitized right now, but once we get those back, we'll have the complete set. And out of the first half of the alphabet, A through K, we have 146 Black worker records. So it's safe to assume we'll have close to 300 when we're done. And doing this kind of systematic review of, the Black worker records and scanning every record will help us to answer basic questions like what types of jobs did Black workers have? If a Black worker didn't live in town, where did they actually come from to work at the Roebling mill and how did they get to work? And more questions. The other project that I'm working on is creating a Black Roebling social network. So this tool, this photo, it's not complete. This is in process, but I created this using a tool called Gephi. It helps you to kind of picture how are people connected to one another? How do they know each other? Um, and how am I creating this? I'm using a really amazing source that we have that tells us about Black social and religious life in Roebling. And that is the Roebling Society column in the Black newspaper, the Baltimore Afro American. So a woman named Liller Bennett, she's actually up here at the top of the network right now. She wrote these columns about twice a month between 1934 and 1936, and it is basically just what are Black people in Roebling up to. So she's talking about Black people who are traveling, visiting their friends in the South, visiting, going to New York, going to Philly. Um, are there relatives visiting from out of town from someone's family? What's going on at the Tabernacle Baptist Church? Are people getting married, etc.? Something that I have been working on since the winter is like going through all of these columns and creating a social network, essentially keeping track of who knows who. How are each of the families connected? Did someone, board with a family? I'm not, this is not, the purpose of this is not like what a family tree is or doing like genealogy necessarily, but truly like how are the families connected? One of the ways I'm doing this is through location. So this Quitman, Brooks County, Georgia, that I'm circling, multiple people came from Brooks County. Two of them are Frank Bennett, who is actually Liller Bennett's husband, and William Young. So I'm kind of tracing geography as well. Um, and then so the article on the left, like all of these people appear on the network right now. So Reverend Alexander, his wife Annie Alexander, the Taylors are down here. So again, this is just a visualization tool that will kind of help us to know how people are connected. And then the last kind of piece of the research that we're doing is you've heard me talk about the census. Using the census data from 1920 to 1950, all the families, Black families who are listed on the census, we've gone ahead and created a family tree for them on our ancestry profile. Some family trees are super fleshed out, really thorough, and others we could not get more than one or two generations or even find records where they show up other than census records. What's really cool is as we worked on the family trees, we would sometimes like find another person on Ancestry who was, it's their family and they've created a family tree, and a person who we're researching appears on their family tree. So then we can make connections with people and say like, hey, we're the museum, we're working on a family tree, and we noticed like this person is part of, our family tree and your family tree. Can you tell us a little bit more about them? And so we've made a couple of connections, and our hope is to like get people to come into the museum and like talk about their family history through that. So that is my portion of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Um, so I'm going to turn it back over to Lynn now, and she's going to talk about, from her perspective, what we would like to learn further.
And I'm gonna unmute myself before I start talking too. So this is all so amazing, Sarah. Thanks for sharing this with everyone. Um, when Sarah started at the museum, she showed up to like a big pile of me saying, here are the things I wish we knew about Black Roebling. And she absolutely dug into so many of those things. And she mentioned the family trees and even some of the census research. We've been able to have volunteers jump in and help because some of that stuff really is like analyzing big data and it takes a lot of work. And you heard her talking about the work records. She physically touched every single worker record to find the Black workers and then she scanned them. So that kind of work takes a good amount of time and energy. And it's almost like the only way you can really learn the stuff is by taking the time to do all that. So there are other opportunities. If any of you guys are interested, every time we do one of these webinars, we get more volunteers because we talk about a project and we're so excited about it. It gets other people interested. So one of the things, and Sarah touched on it a little bit, was doing like a larger examination of the jobs listed. So, like on Black worker records on the census, what are those actual the jobs and the departments, and really making a list and checking out who's doing what and how it changes over the years. Sarah did mention something about like what did the ladder of success for Black workers look like? Were they involved in the union movement in the 40s? Were they excluded from that? There's a lot that we can probably learn on that side of things. We do know that Black workers were later in the union. We have a photo of a union convention in Atlantic City, and there are Black workers in there. So we know they were eventually in the union, but there's definitely more details to learn there. Um, the I mentioned earlier about the Roebling row house. So Black workers absolutely lived in Roebling row houses. I loved in that description that you showed earlier, Sarah. It said 2.5 stories. Their houses were 2.5 stories. But basically the same floor plan as all the other Roebling row houses. So we are hoping to showcase at least one story of a Black family, but in order to do that, the biggest struggle for any of the families that we want to dive into in the Roebling row house, whether they're Hungarian or whatnot, we really need like personal details from descendants. So we need to know like what were the cultural items in the home? What recipes did people use? What, you know, we've been really lucky to like receive donations of like Bibles from grandma and things like that. We definitely need to learn more about that for the Black community in Roebling. We know some things, but not everything. And I know there's descendants out there. I think maybe that's one of our next big, we've already done some work. I think you were mentioning the family trees. We made a family tree for every Black household according to the census, but the census is only a glimpse into town once every 10 years. So we're definitely missing stuff by just using the census. I mean, it's a huge amount of information. We're really glad to have it, but there's definitely, um, some stories in between there that we could learn more about. But we've been having good luck even with Ancestry. When you start to make a family tree, you see who else has made a family tree for those people. And so I have, and Sarah's done it too, we're just sending random emails to people who have really good family trees and saying like, oh, I'm so glad to see you're interested in this family. How are you connected to the Birds or the Richardsons? To try to trick them. And this comes from like the institutional Roebling Museum ancestry account. So we really have been trying to find different and new ways to reach into the community. And we've met at least two people and started relationships through that, which has been fantastic. Um, but in talking to descendants, I think we will learn things that obviously we're not going to find in newspaper articles, we're not going to find on work records, like what drove you to leave Quitman, Georgia? Like what were the specific circumstances to your family? And we have heard some stories like that that are deeply heartbreaking. But there's definitely every family has their own story, and it would be fantastic to learn more. And you can see how that's also true for Hungarian Romanian immigrants. We have a lot more of those stories. They've been recorded, sort of the Ellis Island experience. This is that for the Great Migration. Um, and then I just saw Trish type in the chat. Well, she's helping as a volunteer. We just realized, I mean, I guess we knew, but we became more aware of the fact that the World War I draft cards include Black workers at Roebling. So the World War I draft cards predate the first census, which is 1920, when Black workers lived in Roebling. So this gives even more information about who's in the houses that maybe they really came to town, worked at the mill, hated it, and left, and they might not show up in 1920. So that has been really, really helpful, just to add into our research mountain. but we also kind of don't know what else we want to learn. So you have to sort of start doing the research to figure out if any of you receive our newsletter. I guess it was our last newsletter, was it? Lots and Boone. We had a family reach out to us, and Sarah was mentioning Lula Jenkins Boone. Boone is a huge Roebling name in the Black community. And so we found this worker record for a guy, Lotzen Boone, to answer a query from just an email that came in. And this guy turned out to not be related to the Boones that lived in Roebling. And he worked at the mill for what, like 3 or 4 days? But their whole family came over and we had a whole event at the museum. They told us about him. They looked at the worker record, they shared information with us, and it was absolutely fabulous. It seemed like a great day out for their family, like a cool thing to do on a Saturday, and we were really glad to have them at the museum too. No, it's because she saw a newspaper article written about us getting the worker records. That's what it was. So sometimes we don't know what we're going to learn and when we're going to learn it, but we absolutely, and I see we do have some of our volunteers on this call today. They can absolutely vouch that I make them do really cool research projects, and you can get involved too. Sarah, do you want to chime back in? I'll start to, we saw we had some comments and
Yeah.
questions.
Something that I definitely am curious about, and I don't know how we would find out, but we had a man come in to the museum and say like, "Oh, my father worked here at Roebling, and he was a Jamaican immigrant, and he worked with a group of Jamaican guys." And I was like, "There were multiple Jamaicans? Like, I want to know more about that. Like, why did they come to Roebling? Like, how did they get here, and like what was the relationship between them and like African American workers like?" And he lived in Burlington, like he had kind of told us about his background, but I was curious about that. And then the other thing that I'm curious about is actually one of our questions in the Q&A, and that is, were Black workers paid the same as other workers? And this was a question that I was really starting to try and dig into, because I like, the work is segregated. They have, different jobs, but there are times where like Black male workers they have the same job as a white worker. So you can do like a price comp, but it's not always, and it's based on the census, because in 1930 and 1940 we have like the salary and like the number of weeks worked, so you can kind of like, do a calculation of like how much money were they making a week. But there's other factors that play into like how much someone makes. So like if someone worked at the company longer, they would by default make more money. So like there's a lot of variables that I haven't figured out how to kind of like stabilize yet to like get a real like true answer. Um and like the one time I found the like white fireman boiler guy, I was like, I need to do this price comp like immediately. But again, it's like there are so many variables that determine somebody's pay. But that is something that I really want to dig into more as we kind of like transition this information and like condense it down so that it can be displayed in the museum in some way, so that we have like a clear answer to that question. So I appreciate that question, Donald. Thank you. Um, let's see.
What breakthrough in the research has been the most rewarding?
That question actually comes from my half brother. So hey, Arlander. Um, so what has been the most rewarding?
I think the connections.
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
that day when I saw that both of those families were from Quitman, Georgia, and I was able to email the descendant, be like, wait a minute. And then she knew exactly the other family we were talking about. I think that might have spurred the project to make the network and to look for those other connections.
Yeah. The connections between families, and also like just like the personal connections that you get to make with people who come in. So like Lynn was talking about the Latz and Boone's family, and like you really don't know like what makes a difference to people when you're like maybe emailing with them. And like when I found his worker record, and it said that he worked like 11 days or something, like he wasn't even at the mill for a full pay period at this point. And they came in and they spent, hours just like talking to us, and like
And talking
that
to
was
each other
so
about it
exciting.
too, right?
Yeah. And talking about their memories with him, like, because it was most of the people who had come in where it was like that was their grandfather. Um, so it was just
And
like
the
really
worker
like,
record has really personal details that you would not know about your grandfather directly. Like, it said that he's like 5'1", and they were talking about how he was so short and he was like a tailor in the military. It really was. I felt like it was a real family, outing that day. It was fantastic.
yeah. So I would say the connections and um I don't know. Like this is very, I wouldn't say it's super different from the research I'm doing for my dissertation. Um but it allows me to like use my brain in a different way. Um and while also kind of like still invested in the like urban history of a much smaller place than Philadelphia, which is my, the place where I'm researching for my dissertation. So um I really like the intimacy and like learning about how this like very small place. But I also think what's really rewarding and satisfying is like you look at the numbers and it's like there weren't that many black people who lived here, and like no one has said that to me, and I hope that no one ever says that to me because I'll be like they still mattered, you know, they still mattered immensely. The community that they built was meaningful and worthy of researching. So I think just like getting to the bottom of it and feeling like I'm getting closer to understanding it is the most rewarding part, which is like super vague probably. But that's what I would say to answer that question. Thank you.
All right, there's one other Q&A officially in the Q&A. Are you reading it?
Yes, I am reading it. So this question was from Jong-un. She wrote, I'm a little startled because I would think that African Americans who lived in the US for generations spoke English as their native language compared to recent white immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Am I understanding correctly that race was a more powerful factor than language and comprehension skills for job slotting? That is a really good question. From the research that I've presented today, I would probably say kind of. Like, I think it was a little bit of both because there were jobs that like Hungarian workers were doing that were similarly like considered unskilled. But I do think that like upward movement is what happens after so many years. So like is the Americanization process working, and are these people able to like move into jobs, um, unlike black workers who are kind of relegated to the staying in the unskilled jobs? How would you answer that question, Lynn?
I don't know. It's the first one submitted, so I've been thinking about it while you've been talking, and it made me think, um, like, were there more Hungarians than there were black workers? It feels like the answer to that is yes, but I'm thinking of like I keep coming back to like we need to do more big data. We need to at the same time make everyone individuals, but at the same time make them into spreadsheets and look at it that way. It's really so interesting because I think we could probably get to this question if we were looking at it in a more systematic way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
and Martha
write
actually
this
put a
down.
yeah, Martha had a good point in the chat too. There'd need to be some research to see if there were single language work groups, like your boss could explain the job to you in Slovak.
Or other workers, we've heard that where someone who maybe moved in 1910 is speaking English better than you could translate. Because I think Sarah mentioned this earlier, like you need to trust who you're working with in this kind of a dangerous industrial situation. You need to be able to understand what the warnings are and the instructions as well. So yeah, that's something great to think about. We'll write that down on a post-it, put it up in the office. And I guess the other thing, we haven't mentioned it exactly, but like we could probably be doing some comparisons to other really industrial communities. The thing that is so beautiful about Roebling, like Sarah was saying, is that it's like a micro history. You can really put your arms around the people who physically lived in the company town in a way that like you can't for Newark. Newark has more Black people living there, and are it's definitely been studied as a site of, the Great Migration, but we have like a little tiny town where, and relatively, I mean, it's not a small plant, but comparatively, uh, I think it makes it a really great case study and a great dissertation topic if anyone here is looking for something to study. I think that might be all we've got. One of the things that also occurred to me while I was reading some of the comments was the industrial sports teams. I don't think I've ever seen a Black player in any of those photos.
You know who would
Like,
know is Diane and Debbie because they went through all of those photos. Shout out to two volunteers in the chat um,
yeah, and
who
the
have
guy
gone
George
through
Miller
pictures.
who asked the question, he's super into like baseball history, and it made me think about it. But we gotta pull those. Oh, look at those. Are we done now?
Yes, it is 7:34. So we will wrap up. But thank you so much for joining us for our Black History Month event. We hope you learned something new and interesting. And again, like Black history is very important. So thank you for celebrating that with us. And I just want to give a special thanks to my family members who are here and also people who came from Rutgers. Thank you for showing up for me. And I think I also saw a couple of students who I'm teaching right now who are here. Thanks for coming. Study for your midterm.
Y'all come to the museum next.
Come to the museum um, when you're done with studying for your midterm. And yeah, so just thank you so much to everybody who's here. And if you want to share this with your family or friends, it will be on YouTube in the coming days. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email Lynn or the museum email or well, I don't. I could put my email in the chat for people, but if Lynn gets the email, I will get the email.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good night.